The morning light had barely crept through the slats of the weathered shutters when Eliza Rhodes sat on the edge of the bed, her calloused fingers working through her daughter's dark, tangled hair with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that had held a gun. Pearl was 6 years old, and she sat very still the way she always did, because she had learned early that stillness was safe, that quiet was a shield. Eliza parted the hair down the middle with the careful precision of someone who had no margin for error in anything she did, and she began to braid. The door of the boarding house rattled. Not a knock, a rattle. The kind that said whoever was on the other side of it had already decided they were coming in. Eliza's hands did not stop moving. She finished the first braid, smooth and tight against Pearl's small head, and she reached for the second section of hair. The gun on the nightstand was 3 feet away. She had counted the distance every morning for 2 years. "Mama," Pearl whispered. "I know, baby," Eliza said. Her voice was steady. That was the most important thing she had ever learned, how to keep her voice steady when the rest of her was a wire pulled to snapping. "Hold still for me." The door rattled again, harder this time, and then a voice came through the wood like a blade. "Rhodes. I know you are in there. Fletcher says you have until noon to pay what is owed, or we take the girl instead." Pearl made a sound so small it was barely sound at all. Eliza's fingers did not tremble. She finished the second braid, tied both with the red ribbon she kept in the pocket of her skirt, and then she turned Pearl around by the shoulders and looked at her face. 6 years old, dark eyes like her father's. Her father, who was buried on a hillside outside Laramie under a wooden cross, Eliza had hammered into the frozen ground herself in February alone. "You are going to school," Eliza said quietly. "You are going to go downstairs, and Mrs. Hooper is going to walk you there, and you are going to sit in your seat and learn your letters. You hear me?" "Mama," the man said. "I heard what the man said." Eliza smoothed the front of Pearl's dress. "Your mama should not do everything alone, but today I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Pearl nodded, her chin trembling. It was the truest and most terrifying thing Eliza had ever said out loud. Your mama should not do everything alone. She had said it like a promise, and she had meant it like a prayer, and she had no idea yet that the answer to that prayer was already downstairs, drinking coffee in the corner of the dining room of the Hooper boarding house in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the fall of 1882, with his hat pulled low and his own set of secrets hidden behind eyes the color of river stone. His name was Cecil Vaughn, and he had been watching the door at the top of the stairs since before the rattling started. Eliza Rhodes had arrived in Caldwell 18 months before the morning of the braided hair, the red ribbon, and the voice through the door. She had come from Laramie, Wyoming, with a 6-month-old baby on one hip, a carpetbag in the other hand, and a Colt single-action Army revolver tucked into the waistband of her skirt under her coat. She had not told anyone about the gun. She had not told anyone much of anything. Laramie had taken everything from her except Pearl and the gun. It had taken Thomas Rhodes, her husband, who had been a decent man in an indecent business, running freight along the Wyoming trade routes for a man named Silas Fletcher, who called himself a merchant and was in practice something much darker. Thomas had tried to leave Fletcher's employ. Men who tried to leave Silas Fletcher's employ had a habit of ending up in frozen ground. So Eliza had run, south and east, through country that was hard and beautiful and merciless in equal measure, stopping in towns just long enough to earn passage to the next one, doing laundry, mending clothes, once translating a legal document for a surveyor, because she had been schooled properly back in Ohio before life had taken its sharp turns. She had landed in Caldwell the way a bird lands after a long migration, exhausted and instinctive, not because she had chosen it, but because her body had simply stopped. Caldwell, Kansas in 1882 was a cattle town. The Kishom Trail ran through it, and the railroad had made it into a place where money changed hands fast and law moved slow. It was the kind of town where a woman with a baby and no husband and no explanation could find a room, and a little work without too many questions, because everyone in Caldwell had their own version of a story they were not telling. Mrs. Hooper ran the boarding house on 2nd Street. She was a wide, red-faced woman with iron-gray hair and a voice like a hammer on an anvil, and she had taken one look at Eliza and Pearl and said, "$1.50 a week, meals included, no men above the 1st floor." Eliza had paid in cash she had earned sewing for 3 days without sleep on the train and said, "Yes, ma'am," and that had been the beginning of her life in Caldwell. She had found work at the Mercantile, keeping accounts, because the owner, a nervous little man named Alderman, had discovered she could cipher faster than he could and with fewer errors. She had found a school that would take Pearl in the mornings. She had found a rhythm, the fragile, desperate rhythm of a woman building a life out of whatever pieces she could scavenge, knowing all the time that Fletcher had men who were looking for her. Fletcher wanted the ledger. That was the dark secret at the center of everything. Thomas, before he died, had kept a ledger. Names, dates, payments. Evidence of what Fletcher's business actually was, which was not freight. It was a detailed record of bribery, intimidation, and worse. Thomas had kept it as insurance. It had not saved him. Eliza had it sewn into the lining of her carpetbag, and she knew it was both the most dangerous thing she possessed and the only thing that might someday set her free. She had not gone to the law. She had learned early not to go to the law. The law in Laramie had been Fletcher's law. She did not yet know if the law in Caldwell was anyone different. Cecil Vaughn had come to Caldwell in the first week of October, 1882, which was 3 weeks before the morning of the braided hair. He had ridden in on a bay horse named Copper and checked in at the Hooper boarding house because it was the cleanest-looking establishment on 2nd Street, and he had been sleeping rough for 2 weeks and wanted a bed with sheets. He was 31 years old. He was 6 feet of lean, weather-worn bone and muscle, with dark hair going gray at the temples before its time, and the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was still handsome in a way that had been earned rather than given. He wore a colt on his right hip and a second one at the small of his back, and he wore them with the careless familiarity of a man who had been wearing guns since before he had good reason to. He had been a lawman, past tense. He had been a deputy marshal out of Dodge City, then briefly a town marshal in a place called Hayes that no longer particularly wanted to remember him, and then a man working alone, which was the most honest description of what he currently was. He was in Caldwell because he had received a letter, forwarded 3 times through 3 different post offices, from an associate named Dawes who worked out of the U.S. Marshal's office in Topeka. The letter said, with the careful indirection of a man who did not trust paper entirely, that there was information in Caldwell or heading toward Caldwell that would be of significant interest to federal investigators who had been trying for the better part of 4 years to build a case against a man named Silas Fletcher. Cecil had read the letter twice, burned it, and saddled Copper. He had not told anyone he was coming. He had no badge. He had an agreement, informal and deniable, with Dawes, and he had his own reasons for wanting to find anything that would put Fletcher in front of a federal judge. Those reasons were personal, and he kept them locked away in the same place. He kept everything else he did not want to examine too closely. He had arrived at the Hooper boarding house and had been given the room at the end of the hall on the 1st floor, and on his second morning there, he had come down for breakfast and had seen Eliza Rhodes for the first time. She was sitting at the far end of the dining room table, feeding Pearl with one hand and reviewing what looked like a column of figures in a ledger with the other. She was 30 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of composed, watchful face that told a man who knew how to read people that she was always calculating exits. She was pretty in the way that practical women are pretty, without effort or consciousness of it, and there was something about the way she held herself that reminded Cecil of a drawn bowstring, all that contained tension, all that readiness. He had sat down at the opposite end of the table, poured his coffee, and not spoken to her. She had not looked up. They had maintained this mutual, careful silence for a week, the way two people who are both hiding things maintain silence, not from indifference but from the specific wariness of recognizing that the other person is doing the same thing. It was Mrs. Hooper who finally put them in the same room on purpose. She was not a subtle woman. She announced at supper one evening that she needed the storm shutters rehung before the autumn wind came in earnest, and she looked at Cecil the way a woman looks at someone she has already decided will do what she needs, and then she looked at Eliza the way a woman looks at someone she has decided will supervise, and she said, "I expect you two can manage that without requiring me to hold anyone's hand." Cecil had said, "Yes, ma'am," because it was not worth arguing with Mrs. Hooper. Eliza had said nothing, but had appeared outside with her sleeves rolled up at 7 the next morning, holding a hammer in a way that made it clear she did not need a lesson in how to use one. They had worked in silence for the first 20 minutes. Cecil was on the ladder. Eliza was handing up hardware. Eventually he had missed a catch and a bolt had skittered across the porch and she had retrieved it and held it up to him and their hands had been close and she had said without looking at him, "You are not from here." "No," he said. "Where from?" "Lately, everywhere." He drove the bolt in. "Before that, Dodge." She had been quiet for a moment. Then, "You were law." It was not a question. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with those watchful eyes, and he understood that she had already assessed him completely, had probably assessed him the first morning, and had simply been waiting to decide whether to say anything. "Past tense," he said. She handed him the next bolt. "What brings you to Caldwell?" "Business," he said, which was true, and said nothing. She accepted this. That was the first surprise. Most people would have pressed. She simply nodded and said, "Good enough," and went back to handing him hardware. But something had shifted between them. Something small and cautious, like the first light before dawn, barely there, barely worth naming. He had begun to notice her in ways that were not strategic. The way she read to Pearl in the evenings, her voice low and even, from a copy of a book of fairy tales that looked like it had been read to pieces. The way she laughed at something Pearl said, and how different her face was when she laughed, all that careful composure falling away for just a second to show something warm and unguarded underneath. The way she checked the window before she sat down in any room. That last one he recognized because he did it too. He had also begun to notice things that confirmed his strategic suspicions. The carpet bag she never let out of her room. The way she went pale when she came back from the mercantile one afternoon and found a strange horse tied out front that did not belong to anyone at the boarding house, and the way she did not relax until she had confirmed the horse belonged to a traveling brush salesman who was gone before supper. The way she always knew where the nearest door was. He had written to Dawes. He had described the situation carefully, without naming anyone, and asked whether there was any intelligence about Fletcher moving operatives into the southern Kansas area. Dawes had written back in 11 days. Yes. At least 2 men, possibly 3. He used the name Rhodes once in the letter, underlined, which told Cecil that Dawes knew more than he had put in the first communication. Cecil had sat with that letter for a long time. Then he had burned it, the same as the first. He did not approach Eliza about what he knew. Not yet. She had built walls the way a person builds walls when they have learned that trust is a wound waiting to happen, and he understood that well enough not to push at them blindly. He would need to earn something first. He was not yet sure what. What he had not anticipated was the sound of the door rattling. He had been in the dining room when it happened, 3 weeks into his stay at the Hooper boarding house, on a Thursday morning in the last week of October. Pearl was supposed to be getting her hair done before Mrs. Hooper walked her to the schoolhouse on 3rd Street. Cecil was drinking his second cup of coffee and trying to look like a man with nowhere particular to be. Then the 2 men had come in. They had come in through the front door, which they had not knocked on, and they had passed through the dining room without looking at Cecil, which was their first mistake, and they had gone up the stairs, which guests were not supposed to do unless they were guests, and they were not guests. Cecil had heard the voice through the floor, and the words had been as clear as if they had been spoken in the same room. "Fletcher says you have until noon." He had set his coffee cup down very quietly and had gone to the foot of the stairs. The two men came back down before Eliza did. They were big men in the way that men who are paid to be threatening tend to be big, not with the lean hardness of men who work land, but with the fed, deliberate size of men whose job is their bodies. Cecil was on the third step from the bottom, which meant they were eye to eye when they got there, and they stopped. "Move along," the first one said. Cecil looked at him pleasantly. "Don't believe I will." The second man reached for his hip. Cecil moved faster than either of them expected, and the sequence was brief and efficient. And when it was over, one man was sitting on the floor holding his wrist at an angle that would require several weeks to heal, and the second was looking down the barrel of Cecil's Colt, which had appeared in his hand with the kind of speed that tended to stop conversations. "You are going to walk out of this establishment," Cecil said, in the same tone he might use to observe that the weather was fine, "and you are going to tell whoever sent you that this address is no longer a productive place to conduct your business. Are we clear?" The man on the floor said something that was not words exactly. The man looking down the barrel nodded once very carefully. "Excellent," Cecil said. "Walk." They walked. Cecil holstered his weapon, waited until he heard the sound of horses moving away from the front of the building, and then went upstairs. He knocked on the door at the end of the upper hall, 3 light knocks. There was a long pause, then, "Who is it?" "Vaughn," he said. "Cecil Vaughn, from downstairs. The men are gone." Another pause. Longer. Then the bolt slid back. Eliza opened the door 4 inches and looked at him through the gap. Her hand was on the door and her other hand was not visible, which told him the gun was in it. Behind her he could see Pearl, sitting on the bed with her red ribbons tied in her braids, perfectly still. "You sent them away," Eliza said. "Temporarily," Cecil said honestly. "They will be back, or others will. That is how men like Fletcher operate." The 4-inch gap did not widen, but her eyes changed, a fraction, the calculation in them shifting. "You know the name," she said. "I do." "How?" It was not a question. It was a demand. He met it straight. "I have been looking for evidence against Silas Fletcher for the better part of 3 years, he said. "I was told there might be some in Caldwell. I think it is in your carpetbag." The gun barrel appeared through the gap, leveled at his sternum. "Mama," Pearl said quietly from the bed. Eliza kept her eyes on Cecil. He kept his hands visible and his face open. "If you were Fletcher's man," he said, "those 2 would already be upstairs and you would already know it. I put one of them on the floor and walked the other one out. I heard. Then you know I am not working for him." "Or you are working for him in a more complicated way." He nodded. "That is a reasonable suspicion. What would it take to convince you otherwise?" The gun stayed where it was. But after a moment she said, "Come in." Slowly. He came in slowly. She kept the gun on him while she settled Pearl on the floor with the book of fairy tales and a look that communicated, child to parent, that Pearl was to sit and read and not be alarmed. Pearl accepted this with the grave, adaptable composure of a child who had learned that alarm was not useful. Then Eliza turned back to Cecil. She was still holding the gun. She said, "Tell me who you work for." "Nobody currently." "I have an informal agreement with a man named Dawes who is attached to the federal marshal's office in Topeka. He wants Fletcher in front of a judge. I want the same thing." "Why, personally, not professionally?" Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because Fletcher had a man named Jacob Keller killed in Dodge City 6 years ago. Jacob was my deputy. He was 22 years old and he had a wife and a baby girl, and he found out something he should not have found out, and Fletcher sent men to my office to deal with it, and Jacob walked in during the middle of it and they shot him. And I was not there." The gun lowered 1/2 inch. Not much, but 1/2 inch. "I am sorry about your deputy," Eliza said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. "I am sorry about your husband," he said. The gun lowered to her side. She stared at him. "Dawes told you." His last letter mentioned the name Rhodes. She sat down on the edge of the bed beside Pearl, who had not looked up from her book of fairy tales, but who had leaned very slightly toward her mother, the way children lean toward warmth. Eliza looked at the carpetbag in the corner of the room for a long moment. "There is a ledger," she said. "I know. It has names, dates, amounts paid and to whom, enough to convict him of bribery in at least 4 territories and possibly enough to connect him to 2 deaths directly, including Thomas Rhodes." She pressed her lips together. "Yes." Cecil sat down in the wooden chair by the window, putting distance between them deliberately, giving her space. "Those men will come back," he said. "They will bring more this time, you know that." "I know that. You cannot keep Pearl safe and protect the ledger and deal with Fletcher's men alone." She looked at him, and he knew he had said the thing she had already known, the thing she had been refusing to say to herself, and saying it out loud, hearing it from another person, landed on her differently than thinking it inside her own head. "Your mama should not do everything alone," he said, and it was so gentle and so plain that it was almost not bearable. Eliza's jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright for just a second, the kind of bright that happens when someone is refusing to cry from a combination of pride and exhaustion, and the sudden, unexpected relief of being seen. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. I have no reason to trust you." Also true. She looked at Pearl, who had turned a page with the careful seriousness of a 6-year-old who is determined to believe that reading is possible even when adults are behaving strangely. Eliza watched her daughter for a long moment, and Cecil could see the calculation happening, could see the weight of it, and he did not try to fill the silence. "Pearl needs to go to school," Eliza said finally. "Yes, Mrs. Hooper walks her. I will go as well," Cecil said, "and when I come back we will talk about what to do next." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Small. The kind of nod that is not trust exactly but is the decision to risk it. Mrs. Hooper, when informed of the plan, was unsurprised in the way that women who have run boarding houses for 20 years are unsurprised by almost everything. She collected Pearl's lunch pail in her hand, and the 3 of them went out the front door, Mrs. Hooper and Pearl ahead, Cecil a step behind and to the side, his eyes moving over the street in the habitual scan that never fully stopped. Caldwell's Main Street was alive with the morning commerce of a cattle town. Wagons moved. Men argued in front of the hardware store. 2 cowboys from one of the Texas drives that had not yet made it north before the season closed were sitting on the steps of the saloon looking unemployed. The schoolhouse was 4 blocks north, a white-painted building with a bell that Eliza could hear from the boarding house if the wind was right. Cecil watched the street, watched the alleys, watched the faces. He saw nothing that alarmed him on that walk. Pearl went inside the schoolhouse and looked back once from the door, and her mother was not there, and Cecil saw the small private bravery of that moment. On the walk back he said, "She is a remarkable child." "She has had to be," Eliza said, and there was no self-pity in it, just fact. They walked 2 blocks in silence. Then Eliza said, "You were a town marshal in Hayes for about 18 months. What happened there?" "I found that town marshals in certain towns serve the interests of the men with money more than the interests of the law. I was not suited to that arrangement." She glanced at him sideways. "You resigned." "I was invited to, forcefully, by the town council and a cattle baron named Prescott who had very specific ideas about what the law was for. And you went to work for yourself. That is a generous way to describe it." She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it, the slight softening at the corner of her mouth, and it did something to his chest that he chose not to examine. They sat at the dining room table when they got back, after Mrs. Hooper had set tea in front of them and tactfully removed herself. Eliza retrieved the carpetbag from her room and unstitched the lining with small, precise movements that spoke of having done it before. She laid the ledger on the table between them. It was a standard accounting ledger, the kind used for business records, its cover worn and its pages dense with Thomas Rhodes's careful hand. Cecil opened it with the same care you would use on something you understood was both evidence and memorial, and began to read. What he read took 20 minutes, and it was damning. Names he recognized. Payment figures that corresponded to events he knew about. 3 entries that were not payments but records of orders given and outcomes noted, in language that was careful but not careful enough. He turned pages slowly, and Eliza sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her tea and her eyes fixed on the window because she had read this ledger already many times and she did not need to read it again. "This is enough," Cecil said when he had finished. "Enough for what? Enough for Dawes, enough for a federal warrant." He set the ledger down carefully. "Fletcher will hang." Eliza closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them they were clear. "He will try to stop you." "Yes." "Those 2 men today were only the beginning. He has more, and they will not be as easy to walk out the door the next time." "I know," Cecil said. "We need to get this ledger to Topeka." "We," she said. The word sat between them. "We," he said again simply. She looked at him, that measuring, watchful look, and he held it without flinching because he had nothing to hide from her, not on this, not on the thing that mattered, and he wanted her to see that. "You hardly know me," she said. "That's true." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "But I know enough." "What do you know?" He thought about it honestly. "I know that you ran 800 miles alone with a 6-month-old baby and a carpetbag and a gun, and you built a life out of nothing in a town where you knew nobody. I know that you kept that ledger all this time, even though destroying it would have been safer for you. I know that you checked that window this morning before you opened the door, and that you keep the gun in your left hand when you need your right to be free. I know that you read fairy tales to your daughter every night in a voice that sounds like everything is all right even when it is not." He paused. "I know what kind of person does those things." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. There was something happening in her expression that she was working to keep contained, but he could see it. The way a person looks when they have been alone for so long that being understood by another human being is almost painful. "That is a great deal to conclude from 3 weeks of watching someone," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady. "I am observant," he said, and then more quietly, "and perhaps I was looking." The color came into her face, not much, just enough. She looked back at her tea. They did not have time to let that moment develop into anything because Mrs. Hooper knocked on the dining room doorframe and said, in the flat, informational tone of a woman who considered drama a nuisance, "There are 2 men sitting on horses across the street and they have been there for 20 minutes." Cecil was on his feet and at the window before she had finished the sentence. He looked through the glass at an angle, careful not to give them a clear sight picture. 2 men. Not the same 2 as this morning, different horses, different builds. Fletcher had more than 2 men in Caldwell. Of course he did. "How far is the telegraph office?" he asked. 3 blocks east, Eliza said. She was beside him at the window, close enough that he could smell the clean soap smell of her hair. "I need to wire Dawes. They will follow you." "Yes," he thought. "Is there a back way out of this building?" "Through the kitchen. There is a door to the alley." "Good." He turned to Mrs. Hooper. "Ma'am, if anyone comes to this door asking for either of us, you have not seen us since breakfast." Mrs. Hooper looked at him with the expression of a woman who had not survived 20 years of running a boarding house in a cattle town by being indiscreet. "I have no idea what you are talking about," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Cecil and Eliza went through the kitchen and out the back door, and through the alley with the carpetbag between them. Cecil carrying it because Eliza needed her gun hand-free, moving quickly and quietly through the back passages of Caldwell that were used by deliverymen and people who had good reasons not to be on main streets. The telegraph office was run by a young man named Orrin who had ink-stained fingers and spectacles, and the general demeanor of someone who had chosen his profession precisely, because it did not involve any of the things that were currently happening. Cecil wrote his message to Dawes in the clipped language of men who have learned to communicate urgency without explanation, and Orrin tapped it out with admirable speed and no questions. Then they waited. Eliza stood by the side window of the telegraph office and Cecil stood by the door, and neither of them spoke much, but they spoke some, and it was the kind of talk that happens between 2 people who have agreed without saying so that the wall between them has come down 1 brick. She told him about Laramie. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it. Thomas, who had been good, who had made a mistake, who had tried to get out. The night the men had come. The February ground. The 8 months she had spent getting south. He listened without filling her silences. She told him she had been born in Columbus, Ohio, and had come west with Thomas because he had been full of ideas about opportunity and she had believed in him. "Did you love him?" Cecil asked. "Yes," she said. "He was a good man who made one bad decision and paid for it with everything. I loved him very much." Cecil nodded. He did not say anything intrusive. "I have not," she started and then stopped. "I know," he said. He did know. He could see it, the way the idea of being seen by another person in a way that was not strategic or protective was still strange to her. He was not going to push it. He was not going to push anything. Dawes wired back in 2 hours. The answer was terse and unambiguous. He was dispatching 2 deputy marshals by the earliest train. They would arrive in Caldwell in approximately 3 days, possibly 4. He acknowledged receipt of the information about Fletcher's men in town and said, "Keep the evidence safe, 3 days or 4. Cecil folded the telegram and looked at Eliza. "We need somewhere safe to stay," she said. "Not the boarding house. They know that address," she thought. "There is a woman named Margaret Birch who lives north of town. She is a friend of Mrs. Hooper's. She has taken in Pearl before when I needed time to deal with things. Pearl needs to stay at the school today. Mrs. Hooper will collect her at the end of the day." Eliza was already working through it. He could see the logistics moving behind her eyes. "We go to Margaret Birch, we keep the ledger, we wait for the marshals. And if Fletcher's men find us before the marshals arrive," she looked at him steadily, "then we deal with it." He looked at her for a moment and felt something that was not strategic at all, something warm and slightly inconvenient. "You are not afraid of them," he said. "I am afraid of them," she corrected. "I simply refuse to let being afraid make my decisions for me." Cecil was quiet for a second. Then he said, "That might be the most sensible thing I have heard anyone say in years." The corner of her mouth moved again. Just barely. Margaret Birch was a widow of 55 with a farmstead half a mile north of the Caldwell town limits, a place of solid fences and vegetable gardens going brown in the autumn cold, and 2 enormous dogs that greeted them with the frank suspicion of animals who know their job. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had the particular quality of frontier women who have had to be their own everything for long enough that it has become simply character. She looked at Cecil once, briefly and completely, and then looked at Eliza. "Trouble," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. "How bad?" "Could be very bad for a few days, and then it will be over." Margaret looked at Cecil again. "He with you?" Eliza paused for just half a beat. "He is." Cecil noticed the half beat but said nothing. Margaret took them in. She had a root cellar beneath the barn that could be accessed from inside the barn itself, a secure and invisible space that she had used during periods of conflict before, during the years of the border wars between Kansas and Missouri, when hiding people had sometimes been a matter of life and death. It was not comfortable, but it was safe, and she had a good line of sight from her property to the road north from Caldwell. They spent the first day there mostly in the barn, which was warm with the bodies of Margaret's horses and smelled of hay and old wood and honest animal life. Pearl was brought out at the end of the school day by Mrs. Hooper, who drove her in a buggy with the matter-of-fact composure of a woman who had been asked to do stranger things. Pearl came into the barn and found her mother and Cecil sitting on opposite sides of a hay bale eating bread and hard cheese that Margaret had sent out, and Pearl assessed the situation with the particular intelligence of a 6-year-old who has learned to assess, and then she climbed up on the hay bale between them and ate her own bread and said, "Is this like camping?" "Very much like camping," Eliza said. "Does the man stay with us?" Cecil looked at Pearl. Pearl looked back at him with her father's dark eyes and her mother's direct expression and absolutely no self-consciousness about any of it. "Yes," Cecil said, "if that is all right with you." Pearl considered him for a moment with the gravity of someone taking a vote very seriously. Then she said, "You are tall." "I am," he agreed. "Can you reach things on high shelves?" "I can." Good, said Pearl. Mama has to use a chair. Cecil glanced at Eliza, who was looking at her daughter with an expression that was equal parts mortified and trying very hard not to laugh. That is useful information, he said seriously. That evening, after Pearl had been put to sleep in the small room Margaret gave over to her, Eliza and Cecil sat in the kitchen with Margaret, drinking the strong, dark coffee that Margaret produced from a battered enamel pot as though it were a form of medicine, which in the frontier was essentially what it was. Margaret said to Cecil, with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to it, "You were law." "Was," he confirmed, "but you care about doing the right thing." "I try." Margaret looked at Eliza. "I knew Tom Rhodes," she said. "Did you know that? He came through Caldwell once years ago. Good man." "Yes," Eliza said. "He would want her safe." Margaret said this to Cecil without any particular drama as a fact. "I am telling you that because I think you need to hear it." Cecil looked at his coffee. "Yes, ma'am," he said. After Margaret had gone to bed, Eliza and Cecil sat by the kitchen stove, which ticked and breathed in the way of all good iron stoves when the air outside was getting cold. It was very quiet. The October wind had come up and it was working at the corners of the house. "I keep thinking about what you said," Eliza said. "This morning, your mama should not do everything alone." He looked at her. "I said it to her," she said, "before you did. I said it while I was braiding her hair, and then I heard you say it to me through the door, and it was—" she stopped. "It was like hearing an echo of my own heart." He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not diminish it. "I have been alone for so long," she said, not with self-pity but with the plain honesty of a woman who has stopped performing composure for the night. "I know how to do it. I have had to. But I am so tired, Cecil." She said his name for the first time and seemed to notice that she had, and a slight flush came up in her face. "I am sorry." "Do not apologize," he said, "and you are not alone right now." She looked at him across the kitchen in the low amber light of the oil lamp with the stove crackling between them. He looked back, and something moved between them that had been building since the first morning at the dining room table, since the shutters and the hardware and the observant silence. Something that was cautious and earnest and entirely unstrategic, and both of them knew it. "You said earlier you were perhaps looking," she said. The color in her face deepened. "I did say that," he confirmed. "Why?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking carefully. "Because you are the most capable and the most lonely person I have met in a very long time," he said. "And because courage like yours does not announce itself, and I find that I cannot stop noticing it." Eliza looked down at her hands. They were clasped on the table in front of her, very still. "We are in the middle of a very dangerous situation," she said. "Yes. This is not a good time to—" She stopped. "No," he agreed. "Probably not." They were quiet. The wind pushed at the house. The stove ticked. "Thank you," she said, "for this morning, for sending them out." "You would have handled them yourself," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I did not have to." There it was again between them. The thing that was not just a tactical alliance. He said good night. She said good night. And they each went to the rooms Margaret had arranged, and Cecil lay on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling in the dark and felt something he had not felt in years, which was the particular kind of hope that is not about a case or a conviction or a man who needed to be put in front of a judge, but about a person and a future, and the wild, unauthorized idea that he might not have to be alone either. The second day was tense and quiet and long. Margaret reported that there had been riders on the road, 2 groups looking. Cecil spent much of the morning assessing the property's defensibility in a way that was professional and habitual, and that he tried to keep below Eliza's notice, because she did not need to add his worry to her own. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. In the afternoon, Pearl wanted to help Margaret in the garden, pulling the last of the autumn vegetables before the hard frost came, and Eliza let her go out with Margaret and stood in the doorway of the barn watching them, and Cecil came to stand beside her. "She loves the dirt," Eliza said. "Good for her." Thomas was like that. He was happiest with his hands in something real. She watched Pearl hold up a turnip with the triumph of an archaeologist discovering something magnificent. "She has his laugh." "And your eyes," Cecil said, and then seemed to catch himself as though he had not intended to say it aloud. Eliza turned to look at him. He was looking at Pearl and Margaret in the garden with his jaw tight in that way he had when he was carefully not showing what he was thinking. "Cecil," she said. He looked at her. "I want to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth." "All right. Are you going to leave, when this is over, when the marshals come and the ledger is in Topeka and Fletcher is under arrest?" She said it plainly, without any particular emotional pressure on it, the way she said most important things. "Are you going to get on your horse and ride to the next thing?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said, which was the truth. "That is what I have always done." "I am not asking you to promise anything," she said. "I am asking so I know what I am, so I know how to." She stopped, and for the first time he saw the composure slip in a way that was not about fear or threat but about something more exposed than that. He stepped close enough to speak quietly. "I do not want to leave," he said. "I want you to know that. What I want and what I have permission to want are questions I have not finished working out." "Permission from whom?" He looked at her. "From you." Her face changed. The composure shifted, and what was under it was something unguarded and warm and slightly undone, and she looked up at him in the low afternoon light of the barn doorway and said, very quietly, "You have my permission to want whatever you would like." He did not kiss her. Not then, not in the barn doorway, not with the situation what it was. But he took her hand, very gently, and held it for a moment, and she held his back, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of enough that carries a person through danger. The third day brought one of Fletcher's men to the property, which they had hoped to avoid. He came alone, which meant he was either very confident or he was scouting, and Cecil intercepted him in the lane before he reached the barn, and the conversation was brief and not entirely civil, but ended with the man leaving and Cecil coming back to the barn with a bruised jaw and the useful intelligence that Fletcher himself had arrived in Caldwell by train that morning and was at the hotel. "He came himself," Eliza said. Her face had gone pale. "Which means he is more desperate than his men." Cecil pressed his jaw experimentally and winced. A desperate man makes mistakes, or he is willing to do things his men are not. Also possible, Margaret appeared in the barn door. She was holding a shotgun with the practicality of a woman who kept it behind the kitchen door and had never been shy about using it. "What do we need?" she said. "The marshals," Cecil said. "How far is the rail station?" 2 miles. "If the train from Topeka is on schedule, they could arrive today." He looked at Eliza. "We need to send word to Orrin at the telegraph office to meet them with a message from us." "Who goes?" Eliza said. "I will go. You have a bruised jaw and they know your face." "They know your face too." "My face they know. They know nothing about whether I have anything on me." She looked at the carpetbag. "The ledger stays here, with you." Cecil did not like it, but she was right and they both knew it, and the look she gave him when she said it was the look of a woman who has been competent and independent for long enough that she needs the person she is beginning to care about to recognize it rather than override it. "Be careful," he said. "Always." She went to town on Margaret's dun mare, dressed in a coat that belonged to Margaret and a hat pulled low, and she was gone for 45 minutes that were the longest 45 minutes Cecil had spent in recent memory. He spent them in the barn with Pearl, who was sitting on the hay bale working on her letters on a small slate that Mrs. Hooper had thought to send along, her tongue between her teeth with the effort of forming each one. "See," Pearl said, holding up the slate. "Like Cecil." He looked at it. The letter was respectable. "Well done," he said. "How old are you?" Pearl said with the conversational swerve of a 6-year-old. 31. She considered this. "That is very old." "Thank you. Mama is 30. She says 30 is not so bad. She is right." "Do you have children?" "No," he said. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have not had the right circumstances," he said, which was a diplomatic way to describe the last decade of his life. Pearl nodded sagely. Then she said, "I think you would be good at it." Cecil looked at her. She had gone back to her letters with perfect serenity. He felt something in his chest tighten and then ease like a knot coming loose. Eliza came back with the news that the marshal's train was delayed. Not by a day as Dawes had warned might happen. but by a derailment 40 miles north that had blocked the line. The telegraphed message from the Topeka office via Orrin said they were coming by horse, which would add a day, possibly two. "Does Fletcher know about the derailment?" Cecil asked. "Probably. His man is still watching the telegraph office." "Then he knows time is running against us." Cecil turned the information over. "He will move tonight. If he does, then we do not wait for the marshals." He looked at her steadily. "We take the ledger to the county sheriff." Eliza hesitated. "The sheriff here is a man named Caldwell himself, Arthur Caldwell, no relation to the town, and he is decent, but he is not brave. He does not need to be brave. He needs to be someone with legal authority to hold the ledger and provide protection under the county law. The federal law will catch up." She thought about it. "It could work." "It will work," he said, with more certainty than he entirely felt, because she needed something to hold on to, and he was going to be that thing if it was the last thing he did. That night they were all in Margaret's house, the four of them, with the doors bolted and the lamps low, and Cecil sat at the kitchen table through the late hours while Eliza slept in the chair beside him, her head tipped to the side, her face in sleep, completely unguarded in the way that composed people's faces are when they sleep, all the architecture of control at rest. He sat and watched the window and the door and listened to the wind and let himself think the thoughts he had been not thinking. He thought about what it would mean to stay, to put down roots in a place, something he had not done since before Hayes, before Dodge, back when he had been young enough to think permanence was simple. He thought about Pearl and her letters and her serious assessment of his tallness. He thought about Eliza's hand in his, brief and warm and deliberate. He thought, "This is the thing I have been moving toward, this specific configuration of people in this specific place." He did not usually think in those terms. He was not a sentimental man by nature. But there was something about this family, this incomplete and fiercely held together thing, that called to something in him that had been unanswered for a very long time. 3 in the morning, the sound he had been listening for came. Horses, more than two, moving quietly on the road toward the property. He woke Eliza with a hand on her shoulder, and she was alert in an instant, no transition, which told him everything about how she slept. "Horses," he said. "From the south, at least 4. She was on her feet. "Margaret, I will get her." He was already moving. "You get Pearl. Root cellar under the barn. Take the ladder. I showed you the entrance. And the ledger. Take the ledger. Go." He woke Margaret, who moved with the efficiency of a woman who had prepared for this and went immediately for her shotgun. Pearl was collected from her little room by Eliza, who carried her still sleeping daughter across the cold yard to the barn in the dark, the carpetbag over her shoulder, and went through the hidden entrance to the root cellar that Cecil had shown her 2 days before. Pearl woke on the descent, and Eliza held her very close and pressed her lips to Pearl's hair and said, in the voice she always used, steady as bedrock, "We are safe. We are very safe. Close your eyes." Above them, Cecil and Margaret waited. Fletcher came in with 4 men, which was more than Cecil had hoped and fewer than he had feared. Fletcher himself stayed back, which was the behavior of a man who preferred others to take the physical risks on his behalf. He was tall, expensively dressed for a cattle town in the dark, with the well-fed look of a man who had prospered by taking things from others. Cecil could not make out his face clearly, but he knew the posture. The confrontation in the yard of Margaret Birch's property in the early hours of that October morning was not a gunfight in the cinematic sense. It was briefer and messier than that. Margaret's shotgun accounted for 2 men's courage immediately, in that they stopped and reconsidered their options when the first barrel discharged into the air above their heads. Cecil accounted for a 3rd man. The 4th tried the barn door and found it bolted and spent too long trying to get it open, and Cecil came up behind him and it was over. Fletcher's voice from the darkness, sharp and cold. "Rhodes, I know you are here. You cannot run from this. Give me the ledger and this ends. I have no quarrel with you. It is only property." Cecil called back, "Silas Fletcher. My name is Cecil Vaughn. I am working in an informal capacity with the Federal Marshal's office in Topeka. I am advising you that 2 deputy marshals are in transit to this location and will arrive within 2 days. Any further action on your part tonight constitutes additional federal offenses. I am advising you for your own benefit to take your men and go, and to stay in Caldwell, where the federal marshals will find you when they arrive." There was a long silence from the darkness. Cecil added, "The ledger is already on its way to Topeka by a separate route." This was not true, but Fletcher did not know it was not true. Another silence. Then the sound of horses withdrawing. Fletcher was intelligent, or at least experienced, and he understood that the calculation had changed. Cecil waited 20 minutes, then opened the cellar entrance and called down that it was clear. Eliza came up with Pearl in her arms, asleep again against her shoulder, having apparently decided that whatever was happening above ground was her mother's business and that sleep was hers. Eliza stood in the cold yard and looked at Cecil and Margaret and the situation and said, "Is Fletcher gone?" "For now," Cecil said. "We go to the sheriff at first light. Before he changes his mind. Before he changes his mind." Margaret said something short and definitive about Silas Fletcher and his men that was not suitable for the ears of sleeping 6-year-olds, but that both Cecil and Eliza found entirely accurate. Arthur Caldwell, the sheriff of Sumner County, was, as Eliza had assessed him, decent but not naturally brave. He was also, as Cecil had hoped, genuinely law-abiding, which was not always the same thing as brave and was sometimes more useful. When presented at 8 in the morning with the ledger, an explanation of its contents provided by Eliza with the precision of a woman who had been living with this information for 2 years, and the arrival shortly thereafter of a written confirmation from the Topeka marshal's office that had been wired ahead by Dawes, he stepped up to the requirements of his office with the solid, plodding conscientiousness of a man who knew what duty was even when it was uncomfortable. He put the ledger in his safe. He sent his one deputy to watch the hotel where Fletcher was staying. He sent a message to Caldwell's mayor explaining that the town was about to have a federal law matter resolve itself within its limits and that cooperation would be appreciated. Fletcher was still at the hotel. He had not run, either because he still believed he could retrieve the situation or because he was not certain whether Cecil's claim about the ledger being in transit was true. Either way, he stayed. The deputy marshals arrived from Topeka the following afternoon, late in the day, riding hard and dusty from their overland journey around the derailment. Their names were Adams and Howell, and they were professional, thorough, and clearly briefed by Dawes on what they were looking for. Within 4 hours of their arrival, Silas Fletcher was in the county jail with federal charges filed against him, and the ledger in the custody of the federal government. Eliza stood outside the sheriff's office in the October light when it was done, and she was very still for a moment, the way a person is still when something they have been carrying for 2 years suddenly lifts. She did not cry. She just stood and breathed and closed her eyes, and Cecil stood a few feet away and did not say anything and did not look away. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. "It is over," she said. "The immediate danger is over," he said carefully, because he was an honest man. "Will be a trial. You will need to testify. There may be complications." "I know," she said, "but he is in a cage. He is in a cage." She let out a long breath. Then she looked at him, and something in her face was different from anything he had seen before, something that was not composed or watchful or braced for the next blow, something that was simply open. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. He looked at her. "I told you I did not want to leave," he said. "I remember. I meant it." She looked at the street, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon life of Caldwell moving around them, the wagons and the commerce and the people who did not know that the thing that had just happened had happened. "I don't know what this looks like," she said. "My life here, with Pearl, I work at the mercantile, I live in Mrs. Hooper's boarding house. It is very ordinary." "It sounds fine to me," he said. "Cecil." "Eliza." She looked at him. He looked back. The October wind moved between them. "If you stay," she said, "and I am not asking you to, I am simply saying if, then I need you to understand what you are staying for. Pearl is not she is not incidental. She is the center of this. I know that, And I am not easy. I check windows, I count distances. I wake up at 3 in the morning and I cannot always explain why. I have been alone and responsible for everything for a very long time, and I do not know how to let that go all at once. I am not asking you to let it go all at once, he said. I am patient. How patient? He looked at her with those river-stone eyes that she had been watching for weeks, that she had been trying not to watch, and he said, as long as it takes. The color rose in her face. She looked down for a moment and then back up. All right, she said. All right, stay, she said. If you want to, he smiled at her. It was not a complicated smile. It was the smile of a man who has been given something he was not certain he would be given. I want to, he said. November came to Caldwell with its great flat cold and its enormous sky, and Cecil Vaughn did not leave. He found work, first as a temporary deputy to Arthur Caldwell through the period when the Fletcher situation required coordination with the federal authorities, and then, as the weeks moved into December, in a more informal arrangement where he helped the county sheriff with his caseload, which was substantial, and which Arthur Caldwell was relieved to share with someone who knew what he was doing. He moved from Mrs. Hooper's boarding house after the first week of November, not because there was any impropriety, but because he found a room at a small establishment near the courthouse that suited him better. And from there, he was in and out of Mrs. Hooper's dining room every morning for breakfast in a way that no one at the boarding house bothered to remark on, because it had simply become part of the natural order of things. He and Eliza walked Pearl to school together most mornings. This had begun because of the security concerns during the Fletcher period and continued, because Pearl had begun to expect it, and Pearl's expectations, once established, had a gravitational pull that neither adult was inclined to resist. Pearl held Eliza's hand on the left and had taken to holding Cecil's hand on the right, matter-of-factly, without discussion, having made her own assessment of how things stood. On the third morning when Pearl took Cecil's hand, Eliza had looked at him over Pearl's head. He had looked back. Neither of them said anything, but her eyes were warm and his were the same, and it was its own kind of conversation. He repaired the fence on the north side of the mercantile property when he found it falling down, because Eliza's employer, Mr. Alderman, was a nervous man who did not fix things until they were already broken, and the fence mattered to the cleanliness of the entry. He brought Pearl a book from the second-hand shop he found on his way back from the courthouse one Thursday, a nature book with engravings of birds, because she had expressed an interest in birds the morning she had asked him what kind a large one perched on the schoolhouse roof was. He said nothing about either the fence or the book as things that were significant. He just did them and brought them. Eliza noticed everything. She always noticed everything. She thanked him for the bird book in a way that was slightly more than thanking him for the bird book. She brought coffee to the porch of the boarding house one morning when he arrived for Pearl walking and handed it to him before she handed Pearl over, which was a small domestic intimacy that stopped him for just a moment, the warm cup in the cold morning air, her hand near his. "You fixed Mr. Alderman's fence," she said. "It was falling. He should have done it himself." "He should," Cecil agreed. "You did not have to. I know." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Are you going to keep doing things like that?" she asked. "Things like what?" "Things like," she paused, "being here." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. Her expression was something he was only beginning to have a vocabulary for, something that was careful and warm simultaneously, that had been hurt enough times to be careful and was choosing warmth anyway. Christmas came to Caldwell, the town's modest version of it, with a church service and a gathering at the schoolhouse and decorations in the shop windows that were brave against the gray sky. Cecil had been in Caldwell for 2 months and a half. The Fletcher trial date had been set for the following spring in Topeka, and the federal machinery was moving its slow, certain way toward a reckoning that Eliza was no longer afraid of. On Christmas Eve, Margaret Birch had the whole small constellation of them out to her farmstead for supper, herself and Mrs. Hooper and Pearl and Eliza and Cecil, and they ate roast chicken and preserved peaches and bread that Margaret had made that morning, and it was the most ordinary and sustaining thing. Pearl fell asleep at the table in the middle of her pudding, and had to be carried to the spare room by Cecil, who did it with the careful competence of a man who had never done it before but was determined to do it right. Eliza watched him carry her daughter down the hall and felt something shift in her chest that was so large and so warm that it almost frightened her. When he came back and sat down beside her, very close because the table was full and because neither of them had moved to make more space, he said quietly, "She is out completely." "She always does this," Eliza said. "Special occasions wear her out." He poured her a small measure of cider and refilled his own. Mrs. Hooper and Margaret were at the other end of the table, engaged in the kind of conversation that older women have at Christmas when they have known each other for 20 years, comfortable and continuous and not requiring anyone else. Cecil turned his cup in his hands, the habitual gesture. "Eliza," he said. She turned toward him. The lamplight was low and warm. She could see the gray at his temples, which she had stopped thinking of as something that aged him and had started thinking of as something that was his, particular to him, like the careful way he moved through a room or the way he listened. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing words with the same care he brought to everything he did. "I know this is not the conventional sequence," he said. "I know we have known each other a matter of weeks. I know you have reasons to be careful, and I have not given you enough time, probably, and you can tell me that and I will wait. I mean that." "Cecil," she said. He stopped. "Ask the question," she said gently. He looked at her directly and said, "Is this something, what we are doing? Is this going somewhere for you, or am I reading something into it that is only on my side?" It was so plainly and honestly put that she felt her whole careful composure soften. "It is not only on your side," she said. Something in his face changed. Something that had been held very carefully let go. "All right," he said, and the two words carried a great deal of weight. "I am careful," she said. "I want you to know that I know how to be careful, and I know this is. I know it is fast, and I know I have Pearl to think about, and I know there are things we have not. I know all of that," he said. "I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to let me in." She looked at him, the lamplight between them, the warmth of the room and the sound of Margaret and Mrs. Hooper's conversation going on quietly like a river. "You are already in," she said. He took her hand under the table, where the older women could not see if they looked, and held it the way he had held it in the barn doorway, deliberate and warm, and she held his back. In January, the town of Caldwell had one of its periodic arguments about whether it needed a full-time deputy sheriff, and Arthur Caldwell resolved the argument by hiring Cecil officially, which gave Cecil a salary and a reason that the county recognized for being in Caldwell, though he had already decided he was staying regardless of what the county recognized. He found rooms to rent, larger rooms, a small house on the south end of town that had been empty since the family before had gone east. 3 rooms and a kitchen and a good stove and windows that looked out on the flat Kansas horizon that turned colors in the late afternoon that he had begun to find beautiful. He moved in February with very little furniture and the intention of getting more when the right time came. In March, Eliza testified in Topeka at the trial of Silas Fletcher. She was on the stand for 2 days. Cecil went with her on the train. Pearl stayed with Mrs. Hooper in Caldwell, who had become a kind of fixture in Pearl's small universe, reliable as stone. Eliza on the witness stand was the most composed and the most formidable thing Cecil had ever seen. She answered every question directly. She explained the ledger clearly and completely. She spoke about Thomas's death without drama, only fact, and the fact was damning enough. When Fletcher's attorney tried to suggest that the ledger was fabricated, she looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who has survived too much to be rattled by a lawyer in a suit, and demolished his suggestion so thoroughly that the judge had to remind the courtroom to come to order. Fletcher was convicted on 7 counts. He was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. He would never come for her again. On the train back to Caldwell that evening, Eliza leaned her head against Cecil's shoulder and was quiet for a long time, looking out at the dark Kansas night going past, and he sat still and let her. After a while she said, "It is really over." "It is," he said. "Thomas can rest," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Thank you for coming with me." "There is nowhere else I would be," he said. And this was the simplest and most honest thing he had ever said. Spring came to Caldwell, the big, gusty, green Kansas spring that follows the winter like a held breath finally released. Pearl's letters had become words, and her words had become sentences, and she showed Cecil every new sentence on her slate with the confidence of a person who knows she has accomplished something real. He always read them aloud and told her what they said, and she always looked satisfied, the way only a 6-year-old fully in her rightful position in the world can look satisfied. He and Eliza had been to supper together, just the two of them, on 4 occasions by the time the wildflowers started coming up along the road north of town. The supper arrangements were complicated by the boarding house, which did not have private dining, and the general social textures of a cattle town in which a widow and a deputy were both known quantities whose behavior was noted. But Mrs. Hooper had a parlor, and she made it available on Tuesday evenings, and she herself disappeared into the kitchen with strategic efficiency, and that was how they managed. On the 4th Tuesday, in April, they were sitting in Mrs. Hooper's parlor after the supper things had been cleared, and the conversation had moved through practical matters into the quieter territory that was becoming more natural to them. And Eliza said, "Pearl asked me something today." He waited. "She asked if you were going to be her father." She said it with the directness she always had, but with color in her face that told him this had landed on her with some weight. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her I did not know." She met his eyes. "I want to tell her something better than that." His heart did something uncooperative. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, closing the distance between them. "Eliza," he said, "I have been building toward asking you a question for 4 months. I have been patient because you needed me to be, and I have been glad to be, and I will be patient as long as you need me to be. But if you are telling me that you are ready to have a different conversation, I am telling you exactly that," she said. He looked at her in the April evening light. He had not planned this. He had no ring, no prepared words. He had only what he actually meant, and he had always found that sufficient. "I love you," he said. He had not said it before. They had been careful with that particular word, as two people who understand its weight tend to be careful. "I love Pearl. I want to stay in this town and do this work and come home to the two of you every evening for the rest of my life. I want to give Pearl a name that means she is mine in every way that counts. I want more children with you if you want that. I want to watch you check windows for 40 years, and I want to be the one handing you the coffee when you do." She was looking at him with bright eyes and a steady chin. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. It came out quickly with none of the carefulness, and then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her by her own quickness, and the laugh was so warm and unguarded that it was the most beautiful thing he had heard. He crossed the space between their chairs and took her face in his hands very gently, and she put her hands over his, and he kissed her for the first time, and it was unhurried and sure, and it said everything that 4 months of patience and trust and built understanding can say when it finally gets to be said. Mrs. Hooper appeared in the doorway 17 seconds later, either by coincidence or by design, and took in the scene with the expression of a woman who is thoroughly unsurprised and thoroughly pleased. "Good," she said, and went back to the kitchen. They were married in June 1883 in the small Methodist church on 3rd Street, 2 blocks from the schoolhouse. Margaret Birch brought wildflowers for the church because the florist in Caldwell was limited, and Margaret's field was not. Mrs. Hooper wore her best dress and could be heard from the back pew. Arthur Caldwell, the sheriff, stood with Cecil. Pearl was the flower girl and took the responsibility with a seriousness that made the entire congregation want to smile, which they did, and she forgave them for it because the flower strewing was also genuinely enjoyable. Eliza wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself, which Mrs. Hooper had called practical, and Margaret had called lovely, and Cecil had looked at for a long moment without saying anything and then said, "You are so beautiful," in a tone of voice that was not performing a compliment but simply stating a fact that had surprised him by arriving, and it was the right thing at the right moment. They exchanged their vows in the plain language of the Methodist ceremony, and Cecil put a gold ring on her finger that he had ordered from a catalog in April and had been keeping in his coat pocket since May. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, Pearl called from her position in the front row, "Again!" And the whole church laughed, and Cecil did as he was told. The summer of 1883 in Caldwell was the best summer of Cecil Vaughn's adult life, and he knew it while it was happening, which was rare enough that he paid attention to it. He was a deputy sheriff in a cattle town, which meant long days and complicated people, and the persistent human drama of a place where money and cattle and competing interests were always in motion. He was good at the job, and the job was his in a way that felt sustainable, not like the thing in Hayes had felt, not like the arrangement in Dodge that had always had a transience to it. He came home every evening to the house on the south end of town, which Eliza had transformed with the same competent practicality she brought to everything into something that was genuinely a home. Curtains she had sewn, furniture acquired thoughtfully, the smell of supper and Pearl's voice recounting the events of her school day with the comprehensive thoroughness of a 6-year-old who finds everything equally important and equally interesting. He had formally adopted Pearl in August, with the assistance of a lawyer in Wichita who was practiced in such matters. Pearl had been told what this meant in legal and practical terms by Eliza, who believed children should understand the things that pertain to them. Pearl had thought about it and then said, "So you are my real father now." And Cecil had said, "I have been your real father since October," and Pearl had accepted this as the obvious truth it was and gone back to her bird book. In September, Eliza told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before Pearl was up, in that direct way she had of saying important things. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her and said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" "I feel all right," she said. "A little tired." I felt much worse with Pearl. He came around the table and put his arms around her carefully, as though she were something very precious, which she was, and she put her head against his chest, and he held her there in the kitchen in the September morning, and he did not say any of the many things that were in his head. He just held her, and she let herself be held. Pearl, when told she was going to have a sibling in the spring, responded with a complex series of questions about logistics and practicalities that were so well organized that both Eliza and Cecil were briefly stunned into admiring silence. Then Pearl said, "Can it be a brother? I have nobody to tell what to do." "We will see," Eliza said. "Tell God I would prefer a brother," Pearl said, and returned to her book. The Fletcher trial had given Eliza a reputation in Caldwell, not by her seeking, as a woman who had done something brave and consequential. People treated her with a kind of respect that was different from what she had received before, not unfriendly before, but more seen now, more recognized. She had been approached by Mr. Alderman about taking on a larger role at the mercantile, managing not just the accounts but the ordering and inventory as well. She had agreed, and the role suited her. She had a head for numbers and for the practical architecture of commerce, and she enjoyed the work. She had also, by the autumn, allowed herself to relax into things that she had not allowed before. The window checking did not entirely stop, and he did not expect it to, but it was no longer the first thing she did in every room, every time. She laughed more easily. She argued with him, which he enjoyed, because she was sharper and more interesting in argument than anyone he had met in a long time, and she argued about real things with real information, and did not perform either the deference or the outrage that argument sometimes devolved into with other people. She let him love her, which was the largest thing. She had learned to receive it, not as something that required constant wariness, but as something that was simply hers, that had been given freely and would continue to be given. He could tell the difference between the early months and the autumn because in the early months she had always seemed slightly braced for the thing behind the thing, the hidden motive, the condition attached. And now she was not braced. Now she simply received. He loved her in return with every capacity he had, which was more than he had known before he arrived in Caldwell, more than he had understood himself to contain. He had been a capable and competent man for most of his adult life, and he had been moderately happy when happy and moderately difficult when things were difficult, and he had not known what it was to be genuinely invested in the well-being of specific people in a way that reorganized everything else around it. He knew now. The winter was mild by Kansas standards, and the baby came in April, as calculated, on a Thursday morning that was bright and cold and very clear. It was, as Pearl had requested, a boy. He arrived with considerable enthusiasm and a set of lungs that demonstrated immediately that he was going to have opinions about the world. Pearl stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at her brother with the expression of someone who has received exactly what they ordered and is satisfied with the quality. "He is very loud," she said. "He is," Eliza agreed from the bed, exhausted and luminous, and holding the baby against her chest. "I will teach him not to be loud in class," Pearl said authoritatively, and went off to find something to eat. Cecil was sitting on the edge of the bed beside Eliza, his arm behind her shoulders, and he looked at the boy they had made together, this new small, loud, specific person, and he felt something so enormous and so clean that it had no name he knew. "James," Eliza said. She had chosen the name in January. "James Thomas Vaughn." "James," he said. It was the best word. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he held both her and the baby carefully and completely, and outside the window the April sky was enormous and blue, and the Kansas wind moved through the town of Caldwell like a long, generous breath. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the condition of life and not something that resolves entirely, but full of the substance of real things that matter. Pearl grew into a person of formidable intelligence and considerable personality, who finished the Caldwell School and declared her intention to continue her education in a way that Eliza absolutely supported and Cecil absolutely supported, and that required some creative logistical problem-solving, involving the school in Wichita and a family arrangement with Eliza's cousin in that city that provided proper supervision and housing. Pearl went at 15 with her bird book and her direct gaze and her red ribbon, which she still had, and she was the best student her teachers had seen in years, and she wrote home every week with a thoroughness that was characteristic. James was loud and joyful and physical in the way of boys who have people who love them completely. He followed Cecil with the devoted persistence of a small dog for the first years of his consciousness, and Cecil, who had not known how to be a father when he started and had learned by doing, which is the only way to learn it, was everything to that boy that he had intended to be, steady and present and honest, and never too far away. In 1886, when James was 2 years old, Eliza told Cecil in the same kitchen, the same morning configuration, that they were going to have another child. She said it with the kind of ease she had not had the first time, because this was not the first time, because this was simply their life and it was a good life. He smiled at her across the kitchen and said, "Pearl will have more opinions about this." "Pearl always has opinions," Eliza said. "That is one of my favorite things about her." The third child was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, whom they named Rose. She was small and dark-haired like Eliza, with Cecil's gray eyes and Pearl's absolute certainty about the world, and she enchanted everyone in the Vaughn household from her first day, including James, who regarded her with the solemn protectiveness of a 3-year-old who has been told he is a big brother, and takes the designation with complete seriousness. The house on the south end of town had been expanded, carefully, over the years, rooms added as the family required them. The fences kept up. The garden Eliza had planted growing productive and particular. A kitchen garden and a small flower garden that was for no practical purpose, and that she kept because it pleased her, which was reason enough. Cecil had been made full sheriff of Sumner County in 1885, when Arthur Caldwell retired with his decency intact and his health declining. The county trusted Cecil in the way that communities trust people who have demonstrated over time that they do what they say and say what they mean and treat people fairly regardless of whose interests are being served. He wore the badge with the same kind of low-key honesty he brought to everything, not grandly, not with performance, but with genuine commitment to what it was supposed to represent. He and Eliza had been married 5 years when she came home from the mercantile one October afternoon and found him on the porch with Rose on his knee and James constructing something complicated in the dirt of the yard, and she stood at the gate for a moment before they saw her and just looked at them, and the feeling that moved through her was so complete and so unguarded that she had to take a breath. He looked up and saw her. He could read her face the way he had been reading it for 5 years fluently, with full comprehension. He knew exactly what he had caught on it, and it moved him every time. She came through the gate and Rose reached for her, and she took the baby and sat on the porch step beside him, and James ran to show them the construction in the dirt, which was apparently a fort, and needed strategic input, and they gave it. "You all right?" Cecil said quietly, under James's enthusiastic briefing. "More than all right," she said. He put his arm around her, easy and habitual, the arm that knew exactly where she was, that had found its way to her 100,000 times by this point and still felt like the right answer. "Good," he said. In the evenings they sometimes talked, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, in the kitchen with the lamp low and the coffee that was maybe 1 cup too late in the day, but that neither of them gave up. And they talked the way people who have built a life together talk, about the ordinary and the consequential mixed together without hierarchy, because that was what a shared life was. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had kept in the careful locked rooms of herself. Not all at once, over years. The way trust is built, which is not in large dramatic gestures but in small continuous ones, each one adding to the architecture until the structure can hold anything. She told him once, on a winter night when Rose was new and the older children were asleep, and the wind was working at the house the way it always did, that she had been afraid, for the first months after they married, that she would do something to break it. That she would make a mistake or reveal something that would cause him to revise his understanding of her and find it insufficient. "Of what?" he said, honestly puzzled. "Of me," she said. "Of what I am actually, without the circumstances making it clear. Thomas died and I ran and I kept a ledger and I held it all together, and those things are clear. But just me, ordinary, on a regular day with nothing at stake. I was not certain that was enough." He looked at her for a moment. "Eliza," he said, "it is the regular days that are the whole point. The ordinary you is the one I want. The ordinary you is the one I fell in love with, sitting at the breakfast table at Mrs. Hooper's boarding house reading figures and feeding Pearl without looking up. That was the one." She had been quiet, processing this, and then she had nodded, and he could see her filing it away in the way she filed things away, as true as evidence as something to carry. They had a 4th child in 1890, another boy, whom they named Daniel, who arrived in the summer with the practical ease of a 4th pregnancy, and who slotted into the family with the adaptability of a child who enters a well-running household and simply joins it. Rose adored him immediately. James was interested in him, the way a 6-year-old is interested in a baby, which is to say cursorily, and then comprehensively once the baby could move around and be interacted with. Pearl, who was home from her studies for the summer, held Daniel on her first evening back and looked at him and then at her mother and said, "You and Cecil have been very busy." "Pearl," Eliza said. "I mean educationally. Pearl said serenely. "Daniel will have so many people to teach him things." Cecil, from across the room, made a sound that was successfully disguised as a cough. Eliza looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be stern. Pearl went back to school in September, and Daniel grew and James started to show an interest in horses that Cecil encouraged because he recognized it, and because Margaret Birch, who was still out on her farmstead north of town and as sharp-eyed as ever, had agreed to teach the boy to ride properly, which she did with the same no-nonsense competence she brought to everything. The years folded into each other the way years do when they are lived well and lived fully, each one distinct in its particulars and continuous in its warmth. The house on the south end of Caldwell became known in the town as the Vaughn house, a house where the door was often open, and there was usually coffee, and where Eliza ran a household with the efficient warmth of a woman who has chosen every element of her life deliberately and is at peace with every choice. Cecil was in his 40s now, the gray at his temples having spread to fully gray hair that Eliza ran her hand through sometimes with the easy propriety of a woman who has been touching someone's hair for years. He was still lean, still carried the guns because the job required it, still had the watchful eyes and the habitual room assessment, though the edge on it had softened with the years into something more like general attention. He still woke sometimes in the early hours, old habit, listening for what was not there. On those nights, if Eliza was awake too, they would lie in the dark and talk quietly, the way they had gotten used to doing about whatever came, and then sleep again. And if she was not awake, he would lie still and listen to her breathe, and to the children's various nighttime sounds, Rose's occasional murmur, Daniel's solid sleep, and it was the most sustaining sound he knew. Pearl wrote from Wichita in the spring of 1892 that she had met someone. She described him in the careful, thorough way she described everything, a young man named Collins who was studying law and who was, she said, the most sensible and direct person she had met outside her own family. Eliza read this letter to Cecil at the breakfast table and they looked at each other over it. "She says he is direct," Eliza said. "Of course she does," Cecil said. "She has never had patience for the other kind." Pearl brought him home that summer, a serious young man with good hands and an honest face who shook Cecil's hand and looked at him straight on, and said he intended to practice law in western Kansas, and that he admired what Pearl had told him of the family's history. Cecil had liked him in that initial meeting and trusted the liking because he had learned to trust his assessments. He took the young man aside, not formally, not theatrically, but practically on the porch after supper one evening while Pearl and Eliza were inside, and the children were doing whatever the children did in the summer dark, and he said, "She is the best person I know. She is also one of the most capable people I know. She does not need to be managed. She needs to be valued." Collins had said simply, "Yes, sir, I know that." Cecil had nodded. "Good." Pearl was married 2 years later in 1894 in the same Methodist church on 3rd Street, and the wildflowers were from Margaret's field again because Margaret Birch was 72 and still growing them, and she was not about to stop doing it for a wedding she was very invested in attending. Eliza wore a dress of a deep gold color that Pearl had selected for her with her characteristic certainty about what was right, and Cecil thought she was the most beautiful woman in the county, and he told her so, and she told him he was biased, and he said yes, absolutely, and she laughed. He danced with her at the small celebration held at the Vaughn house after the church service, a real dance, the kind with a fiddle that Mrs. Hooper's nephew played with unexpected competence, in the main room that had been cleared for it, and they moved together with the ease of two people who have been in each other's orbit for so long that they have learned each other's rhythms in everything. "Look at her," Eliza said, watching Pearl across the room, bright and certain and exactly herself. "I am looking at you," Cecil said. She turned her face up to his. After 11 years there was still that warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, still that particular softness that was only there when she looked at him, that was not composure or watchfulness or strategy but simply what it was. "I love you," she said very simply. "I know," he said, "and I love you. I cannot imagine any other arrangement." She put her head against his shoulder and they danced. And around them their children moved through the room. James, almost 16 and beginning to have his father's build. Rose at 7 making Pearl's new husband dance with her in the corner. Daniel at 4 watching everything with the solemn attention of a child who is storing it all for future reference. It was an ordinary evening in a good life that had been built out of hard material and honest effort, and the courage to trust when trust was earned. Eliza Rhodes had braided her daughter's hair one October morning and said that a mother should not do everything alone, and in that moment had named both her need and her fear, and the man who had been listening through the floor had understood both and had shown up completely, for the decade and more that followed, in every way that a person can show up for another. She had let him in. He had stayed. That was the whole story, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of life that people who have survived the worst things sometimes find on the other side, not by forgetting what was hard, but by building something real enough that the hard things become context rather than definition. Cecil retired as sheriff in 1901, at 50, when the county brought in a younger man who had the energy for it, and who Cecil had trained with the thoroughness he brought to everything he did. He went home on his last official day and hung his badge on the nail by the back door where he always put it and sat at the kitchen table, and Eliza poured him coffee and sat down across from him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "what will you do?" He looked at the house, at the kitchen they had been in 1,000 mornings, at the woman across from him who was 49 and as direct and warm and capable as she had been at 30, who checked windows less but still noted exits, who read to her grandchildren now with the same voice she had used for Pearl's fairy tales, steady as bedrock. "I am going to fix the north fence," he said. "And then I am going to plant whatever you want in the kitchen garden. And then I am going to be here." "Here," she said. "Here," he said. She looked at him across the coffee and the table and the years, and she reached out and put her hand over his. "That is exactly right," she said. The Kansas morning was wide and bright outside the windows. Somewhere in the house, their youngest grandchild, Pearl's baby, was beginning to make the sounds of waking. The day was opening like every day opens, full of its ordinary particular demands and its particular ordinary blessings. And Cecil Vaughn and Eliza Rhodes Vaughn sat in the kitchen of the house they had made and held each other's hands in the light, and it was enough, and it was everything.